In the blinding snowstorm, a little girl's cry echoed through the freezing dark forest. A desperate man plunged into the shadows, following the crimson trail carved into the snow. Every step was a race against death, every breath a prayer. And then through the swirling storm, a loyal dog emerged, its eyes burning with both salvation and the haunting shadow of death. The night held its breath, and destiny balanced on the edge of survival. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any dramatic and emotional episodes from us. The screen fades in on white chaos. Snow whips sideways across the frame, a living wall of ice and fury that erases the horizon. The camera pushes through the storm visibility, collapsing into a blur of white and gray. Then, almost hidden against the endless sweep of snow, a small figure stumbles forward. Lila Anderson, 13 years old, is swallowed by the storm. Her hair is plastered against her cheeks, stiff with ice. Her oversized coat hangs like a shroud, ripped in places, stolen from a donation box weeks ago. Each step is a war, her thin boots breaking through the snow crust, her breath heaving in shallow gasps that cloud and vanish. There's no road here, no path, no sign of civilization. Just endless Montana wilderness under siege by the storm. But she keeps moving because stopping means dying. Her lips are cracked and bleeding. Her hands, wrapped in mismatched gloves, tremble violently. Her eyes, wide and frantic, dart left and right as though the storm itself might open up and swallow her. Somewhere behind her, far back in the dark corners of her memory, echoes the sound of locks, clanging children crying, the smell of bleach and decay from the illegal shelter she escaped. Every gust of wind feels like hands trying to shove her back into that nightmare. She forces herself forward. The wind howls, and she slips, falling face first into the snow. She doesn't move for a moment. She thinks about just letting go, letting the storm cover her. No one would notice, no one would care. The thought crushes her chest, heavy and final. But then she hears something. Not the storm, something different. A low guttural sound, half growl, half whimper, just ahead through the white blur. Her body reacts before her brain does. She scrambles up, heart hammering. The sound comes again, sharper this time, carrying pain warning and desperation all at once. She squints against the blizzard and sees a dark shape half buried in snow. At first it looks like a broken tree limb. Then it shifts, pushing feebly against the snowdrift. She takes a cautious step closer. The shape lifts its head. Two eyes catch the weak light, fierce, wild, and burning, even through exhaustion. It's a dog, not just any dog. A Malinois, lean and muscular, even in its collapsed state, its fur matted with ice and streaked with blood. A tactical harness still clings to its torso, half-torn buckles twisted as though ripped away in violence. One of its legs drags awkwardly, the shoulder clearly wounded. The animal bares its teeth at her approach, a deep, warning growl vibrating out of its chest despite its weakness. Snowflakes cling to its muzzle, mixing with flecks of red. Lila freezes. Every instinct screams to back away. She's seen dogs before. Strays around the shelter mean mutts that snapped at kids. But this one is different. Power radiates from it even now in its brokenness. The dog's eyes lock on hers, not just looking, measuring. Lila swallows hard, her lips trembling. I'm not going to hurt you. Her voice is nearly stolen by the wind. She crouches low, hands out, showing emptiness. She knows hunger. She knows pain. And something in those eyes mirrors her own reflection, abandoned, wounded, unwanted. The growl fades into a shaky breath. The dog doesn't lunge, doesn't crawl away, just stares at her like it's deciding whether to let her close. Her hands shake as she pulls at her coat, tearing the frayed lining from the inside. She edges closer, foot by foot, the snow biting at her ankles. She lays the cloth down near the dog's muzzle like an offering. The Malinois lowers its head, sniffing. Its nostrils flare. A moment of silence stretches thin, fragile as ice. Then slowly, the dog allows her closer. She kneels beside it, careful not to touch the wounded shoulder. Her eyes sting from more than the cold. She whispers, "You're hurt. You're like me." The dog doesn't growl this time. Its chest rises and falls with heavy breaths. When her fingers finally brush its fur, rough, wet, and sticky with blood, the animal tenses but doesn't pull away. For the first time in days, Lila feels warmth. Not from the dog's body, not from the thin fabric between them, but from something deeper, recognition. They are both survivors dragged into the teeth of a storm, both discarded by the world. The blizzard roars, but inside this fragile pocket of trust, there is silence. She knows they can't last long like this. Her bones feel brittle, her stomach hollow. The dog is bleeding out. If they don't find shelter, they'll both vanish under the snow by morning. Her eyes scan desperately until she sees the faint outline of a rock outcrop. Not much, but maybe enough to block the worst of the wind. "Come on," she whispers, sliding her arms under the dog. It's heavier than she imagined, muscles coiled even in exhaustion. She grits her teeth, staggering, dragging it toward the outcrop. Every step is agony, her legs burning, lungs raw. The dog doesn't fight, just watches her with those eyes sharp and unwavering, as if testing her strength. Finally, she collapses inside the shallow alcove, panting, her arms trembling. The dog lies beside her, its breath's ragged body shivering violently. She rips the last scrap of fabric from her coat, pressing it against the wound. Blood stains her gloves. She clenches her teeth, whispering, "Stay with me. Please, don't leave me too." The dog whimpers low in its throat, a sound that slices through her chest. She's heard children cry in cages. She's heard her own voice breaking in the dark. But this sound is something else. A warrior broken. A protector abandoned. Her hands fumble with matches from the shelter, a half-used box she pocketed weeks ago. She strikes one, shielding the flame against the wind. Sparks leap, catching on brittle twigs she gathered earlier. Soon a small fire crackles between them, fragile but real. Orange light flickers across their faces. For the first time, she sees the Malinois clearly. The scars across its muzzle, the deep intelligence in its eyes, the pain carved into every line of its body. And for the first time, she feels seen not as a runaway, not as a mistake, but as someone worth trusting. The dog inches closer to the fire, then closer to her. Not touching, not yet, but close enough that she feels its heat. Lila hugs her knees, staring into the flames. Her voice is barely more than breath. "I don't even know your name." She studies the harness fingers, tracing the half-torn patch where letters once were. Only fragments remain. "GR," she whispers, "Ranger." The dog lifts its head, eyes locking with hers, almost like acknowledgement. She nods, the ghost of a smile breaking through her cracked lips. "Okay, Ranger. It's you and me now." The storm howls outside, trying to drown them. But here in this small alcove lit by trembling firelight, a fragile bond is forged. Two broken souls tied together not by choice, but by the desperate need to survive. And in that moment, as Ranger lowers his head against his paws and Lila leans closer to the fire, a spark of hope flickers against the endless white. The night does not relent. The storm presses harder, the kind of cold that feels alive, biting through fabric and skin, wrapping everything in silence, broken only by the shrieking wind. Lila sits huddled against the alcove wall, her head heavy with exhaustion. Ranger curled close, firelight trembling weakly against the stone. Every crack of ice outside feels like a warning. Every gust rattles her ribs like a fist. She dozes, but not for long, because suddenly the mountain screams. A sound erupts above the howl of the storm metal, shrieking glass shattering, the thunderous crunch of something massive tumbling into rock. It cuts through the night with terrifying finality. Lila jolts upright, eyes wide. Ranger's ears snap forward, his body stiffening, a guttural growl vibrating from his chest. The fire sputters as the wind surges, and for a moment the storm itself seems to hold its breath. Then silence again, but not the same silence. This one tastes heavier, charged. Something has happened, something close. Lila swallows hard, her throat raw. Her instincts scream to stay hidden, to curl up and let the storm erase it all. She knows what waits in the world when she steps out: hunters, traffickers, pain. But the sound she heard wasn't the sound of a predator. It was destruction. A cry for help buried in twisted steel. She looks at Ranger. His golden brown eyes bore into hers, sharp and urgent. He doesn't need words. He's already moving, limping toward the storm's mouth, glancing back once as if to command, "Come." Her legs ache. Her body begs to stay. But she rises anyway. Because even though she's 13, even though she has nothing, no family, no warmth, no safety, something inside her refuses to let her walk away from another soul in danger. Maybe because no one ever came for her. Maybe because she can't stand to see someone else left behind. Snow slashes her face as they leave the alcove, the fire dying behind them. She clutches her coat tight, stumbling after Ranger, who moves with grim determination despite his wounds. The blizzard swallows their shapes, but then through the curtain of white, an orange flicker glows faintly below. Not fire. Hazard lights blinking weakly against the snow. She scrambles to the edge of a ravine, her breath catches. A police cruiser lies on its side at the bottom of the gulch. Metal-twisted windows shattered the roof, crushed against rock. The hazard lights blink like a failing heartbeat, casting eerie pulses across the wreckage. Snow swirls over the vehicle, already trying to bury it. Her chest tightens. She knows uniforms, knows sirens. They mean cages. They mean questions. They mean being sent back. Every instinct screams to run. But then she sees it, blood streaking the snow from the driver's window, too much spreading fast. A man is trapped inside. Her heart pounds so loud it drowns the storm. She grips the icy slope, trying to steady herself. No. No, no, Ranger barks once, sharp, urgent. He lunges down the embankment, claws digging into ice, sliding, but refusing to stop. He reaches the wreck and presses his muzzle to the shattered glass, barking again. Lila's body shakes, caught between terror and something stronger. She stares down at the wreckage, at Ranger, demanding her courage. Then she moves, sliding, clawing, tumbling down, until her knees crash into the snow beside the mangled door. Her hands fumble against the frozen handle. It doesn't budge. She peers through the glass. The driver is slumped sideways, pinned by the collapsed steering wheel. Blood covers his temple, leaking into his graying hair, dripping across his uniform. His lips are pale blue. His chest rises, faintly shallow, but alive. Lieutenant Daniel Moore. His badge gleams faintly under the hazard light, scratched and smeared with blood. Lila gasps, shoving against the door with all her weight. It groans but doesn't open. Ranger snarls, biting at the twisted metal, pawing furiously, as if sheer will could rip it free. Panic claws at Lila's throat. She looks around wildly, snow blinding her, searching for anything leverage, a branch or rock. Her eyes land on a jagged stone half buried nearby. She grabs it, her fingers numb and clumsy, and smashes it against the remaining shards of glass. The window explodes inward. Snow blasts into the cabin. The cold rushes over Daniel's still form. Hey. Her voice cracks weak against the wind. She reaches inside, shaking his shoulder. Wake up. You have to wake up. No response. Just a low groan, the sound of someone drifting at the edge of nothing. Lila bites down, panics. She pulls at his arm, straining with everything her thin frame can give. He doesn't move. His leg is wedged against the crumpled dashboard metal, pinning him. Ranger, her voice breaks. She doesn't know what she expects. He's a dog, he can't move steel. But Ranger dives through the broken window, his body forcing into the wreck, his jaws clamping onto the strap of Daniel's vest. He pulls, muscles shaking with effort, growling deep as he heaves. The sight ignites something in Lila. She throws herself against the bent metal, pushing, kicking, screaming with frustration. The metal shifts a fraction. Not enough. But enough to let Daniel's legs slide an inch. She yanks again at his arm. Come on, please, come on, Daniel groans, eyelids fluttering. For a second, through the haze of blood and pain, he sees not the storm, not the wreck, but a face, gentle, worn with sorrow, eyes filled with fire and tenderness. A woman's face. The resemblance to Lila is unmistakable. Her mother, younger, standing in the half-light of memory. Her voice whispering through his fractured consciousness. Don't let her be alone. Don't let her disappear. His lips part a broken whisper, lost in the storm. Anna. Lila freezes. The name hits her chest like a hammer. She doesn't know how he knows. Doesn't know why he said it. But she pulls harder, tears stinging her eyes. Don't you die on me. Ranger snarls with effort, yanking until the strap snaps free. The momentum jerks Daniel sideways. The metal groans, shifts another inch. Lila seizes the chance, shoving with all her weight. The dashboard creaks, finally giving just enough. With one last scream, she drags Daniel out, his body collapsing into the snow. He's heavy, far heavier than she imagined. His blood stains her gloves, streaks across her coat. His breaths are shallow, rattling. His eyes roll beneath half-closed lids, caught between worlds. Lila kneels over him, trembling. Ranger presses against his other side muzzle, nuzzling Daniel's chest, whining low. Stay with me, she pleads, slapping his face lightly. Don't go, please. His eyes flicker open for a heartbeat. They land on her messy hair, frozen with ice, face streaked with dirt and tears, eyes wide with desperate defiance. And in that heartbeat, Daniel doesn't see a stranger. He sees the echo of the woman from his past, her daughter's face carrying the same fire. He doesn't understand how. Doesn't need to. His lips part. A whisper escapes. You look like her. Then his eyes roll back, his chest shuddering. Lila presses her hands against his wound, panic consuming her. No, no, no. She looks at Ranger, desperate. The dog meets her gaze, and in that look, she feels an order, a command. Don't quit. The hazard lights keep blinking, casting their faces in pulses of orange and shadow. Snow piles higher, threatening to bury them all. But in this moment, 3 lives hang together by a thread, a girl who refuses to abandon a dog, who refuses to stop fighting, and a man caught between the living and the dead, tethered to them by memory, blood, and fate. And the storm rages on as if determined to erase them before dawn. The night was a frozen cathedral, silent, except for the wind that howled like a wounded beast across the Montana ridges. Snow carried secrets in its unbroken white shroud, covering evidence, suffocating sound, making even screams vanish into nothing. Somewhere below, that silence far from the fragile glow of the sheriff's station, or the faint lights of scattered ranch houses, men moved with purpose. And above them, all watching from the warmth of glass walls and polished marble floors, Victor Kane was smiling. Victor's office looked out over the city and the valley, an empire carved from cold ambition. His reflection stretched across the pain-sharp cheekbones. Steel-gray eyes, a mouth set not in cruelty, but in the kind of detachment that could order 1,000 deaths as easily as ordering wine. He had built Kane Minerals out of lies, bribes, and silenced voices, turning frozen mountains into rivers of profit. And now a single accident threatened to expose the rot beneath his fortune. The report lay before him, a patrol car overturned in the gorge, the officer presumed dead. No mention of survivors. No mention of the girl. No mention of the dog. To the outside world, nothing had happened but a tragic accident during a blizzard. But Victor knew better. His men had failed him, and failure was unacceptable. He pressed play on the surveillance feed intercepted earlier. Grainy, distorted, but enough. Through the storm's veil, he saw movement, a thin girl dragging at the crumpled door, her body frail but stubborn. And then his eyes narrowed, a flash of tan fur, the distinctive posture of a Belgian Malinois. Ranger. Victor's pulse quickened, though his face remained unreadable. He had spent years trying to erase that name, that animal. Ranger was not just a dog. Ranger was a relic of a classified program, a weapon in fur, an experiment blending loyalty and lethal precision. Ranger had vanished years ago during a botched mission overseas, presumed dead. And now here he was, limping in the snow alive, Defiant aligned with a runaway girl and a half-dead cop. The irony would have made Victor laugh if he were capable of laughter. Instead, he leaned back in his leather chair, hands steepled. If Ranger lived, then Ranger remembered. And if Ranger remembered, there were things buried in his training, in his responses, in his code, that could unravel secrets Victor had spent a fortune to bury. He thought of the girl again, replaying the image of her face, frost-bitten lips, wild eyes, a scarf torn and dirtied. She was nobody, a stray tossed into the storm. Yet, something in the angle of her cheekbones nagged at him, like a ghost tapping against glass. A memory surfaced, faint but sharp enough to sting. A journalist's face framed by cameras years ago, her voice trembling with the fury of truth as she accused Kane Minerals of blood on its hands. That journalist had vanished in an accident too. A woman with fire in her eyes and questions in her mouth. Victor Kane exhaled, slow and deliberate. Could it be? Was the girl connected to that woman? Was fate cruel enough to weave these threads together? Binding the past, he thought, buried to the present, he was trying to control. He swiveled in his chair and pressed a button on the intercom. A man's voice responded instantly, curt, afraid. Sir. 2 complications survived the gorge. Victor said, his tone measured, stripped of emotion. 1 is Daniel Moore. There was silence, then a hesitant reply. The lieutenant, he shouldn't have. And the other, Victor interrupted, is Ranger. The air shifted through the line, the weight of the revelation crushing even the hardened operative on the other end. Ranger, that's impossible. Nothing is impossible, Victor replied coldly. Only unacceptable. Find them, erase them. I want no trace left, not of the girl, not of Moore, and especially not of that dog. He cut the line before the man could answer. His orders were not requests. They were verdicts. But Victor was not finished. He tapped a secure console, the screen flickering into coded layers before revealing a single file, Project Haven. It was supposed to be extinct, destroyed on paper, shredded in memory. Yet here it was, alive, in the snow, bleeding from its shoulder, snarling against the storm. Project Haven had been born out of desperation. A military contract to weaponize loyalty itself, to mold animals into more than companions, to make them memory carriers, signal decoders, living shadows. Ranger had been the prime success. And when the program imploded under scandal and whispers of abuse, Victor had bought silence. He had burned warehouses, silenced scientists, erased witnesses. But he had not erased the dog. And now Ranger threatened to undo everything. Victor Kane rose from his chair. His movements were slow, precise, the way predators move when the kill is inevitable. He poured himself a glass of whiskey amber fire against the cold outside. His reflection watched him, but behind it, he imagined another reflection, a young girl with her mother's eyes standing beside a wounded dog, pulling an officer out of wreckage. Not this time, Victor whispered to the glass. No more ghosts. Below him, his men assembled in the dark. Black SUVs with tinted windows waited in the storm engines, rumbling like beasts hungry for blood. Orders spread quietly, checkpoints on the roads, drones to sweep the ridges, silencers on every weapon. Victor's empire had resources beyond law, beyond sight. The girl and the dog would not escape the net. But in the silence after his commands, a thought lingered, a rare, unwelcome thought. Ranger was not just a threat. Ranger was proof. Proof that the project had worked, proof that Victor Kane had engineered loyalty itself. Killing the dog would erase the danger, but capturing it. Oh, capturing Ranger could give him back the weapon he had lost. He finished his drink, the ice clinking like distant chains. Perhaps he would not kill the dog immediately. Perhaps he would break it again, reshape it, make it serve him once more. As for the girl and the officer, they were disposable. Pawns crushed under the king's stride. Outside, the storm screamed against the glass, but Victor Kane no longer heard the wind. He heard only the drumbeat of inevitability. His men would find them. The mountains could not protect them. The snow could not bury them. And when the firelight of his empire burned across the peaks, no one would remember the girl or the cop or the loyal animal that defied him. In the darkness of Montana, the hunt had already begun. The first thing Daniel Moore felt when he clawed back into consciousness was the weight of cold pressing against his chest. It wasn't just the air, it was inside him, rattling in his lungs, a frost that wanted to root itself in his blood. Then came the pain, sharp and merciless, crawling up his ribs and blooming in his skull. For a long moment he couldn't separate the pounding in his head from the storm roaring above, but then through the chaos came a voice. Fragile, urgent, human. Stay with me. Please don't close your eyes. Daniel forced them open. A face hovered above him, pale and streaked with dirt, strands of hair plastered wet across her forehead. Her eyes wide, terrified, but burning with something fierce. He didn't know her name yet, but the desperation in her tone anchored him. Beside her, a shadow of movement, 4 legs, tan fur stained dark by blood. The dog. Fragments of memory came back. The crash. The cliff. And then, her pulling at the door, dragging him through fire and ice. The world tilted as he tried to sit up. Agony screamed through his chest. He sucked in air and tasted iron. But he stayed upright. Because with the storm shrieking around them, with death circling in the white void lying down, meant surrender. And Daniel Moore had never been a man to surrender. The girl Lila pressed a trembling hand to his arm. We can't stay here. They'll come. Her words cut sharper than the cold. They. Not rescue. Not help. They. And in that instant, Daniel understood this wasn't an accident. He had been marked. A flicker of rage flared in his chest. He didn't know the full picture yet, but he didn't need to. A veteran's instinct whispered to him something bigger was moving in the shadows, and the 3 of them were prey caught in its teeth. He scanned the dog. Ranger stood braced against the wind, muscles taut, one leg dragging slightly where blood matted the fur. Yet his eyes burned alive with the kind of determination Daniel had only ever seen in soldiers who refused to break. There was intelligence there, more than instinct. Ranger wasn't following, he was leading. Daniel staggered to his feet, leaning heavier on Lila than his pride wanted to admit. Which way, he rasped. Lila pointed toward the jagged tree line barely visible through the snow. If we cut across the ridge, we can make it back to town. Maybe. Then we move, Daniel said. Now. They pushed forward step by step, swallowed by the storm. Every gust was a hammer, every flake a shard of glass slicing exposed skin. The world shrank to a tunnel-white walls, no sky, no earth, just a path carved by desperation. Behind them, the first echoes came. Low at first, then sharper. Engines, tires clawing through snow, headlights bleeding faint halos into the blizzard. The hunt had begun. Lila froze, eyes wide. Daniel grabbed her shoulder, forcing her forward. Don't look back. Keep moving. Ranger growled a sound too deep for an animal his size, vibrating with defiance. His ears twitched, head lowering as the silhouettes emerged behind black SUVs, crawling like predators across the ridge beams of light cutting through the storm. The men spilled out dark shapes against the white. Muzzles flashed as silencers spat death into the snow. Bullets hissed past past, carving the storm with invisible claws. "Down," Daniel barked, dragging Lila into the drift. The snow swallowed them, icy teeth gnawing through their clothes. Ranger lunged ahead, positioning himself between them and the approaching shadows. A shot cracked too close, and Daniel felt the sting of snow sprayed by impact. He forced air into his lungs, ignoring the scream in his ribs. "We move on my count. Stay low. Don't stop." Lila's teeth chattered, but her eyes never wavered. She nodded. Ranger's growl deepened a rumble against the storm. 3, 2, 1. They bolted, stumbling forward in a crouch, weaving through half-buried rocks and twisted pines. The snow punished every step, sucking at their legs, dragging them down. But the alternative stopping was death. The gunfire followed, muffled but relentless. Shadows fanned out behind hunting dogs in human skin. And through it all, Ranger became more than protection. He became momentum. When Lila faltered, he nudged her forward. When Daniel stumbled, the dog circled, pressing against his leg, forcing him upright. And then Ranger struck. One of the gunmen broke too close, sprinting through the snow with weapon raised. Ranger launched a streak of fury in the white. His body collided mid-air, teeth clamping down on the man's arm. A scream ripped through the storm as the gun tumbled away. Ranger twisted, pulling the man off balance, dragging him into the drift. Blood sprayed across the snow, stark as paint on canvas. "Go!" Daniel shouted, pulling Lila. They ran, the storm swallowing Ranger's snarl and the man's muffled cries. But victory was brief. More shapes loomed, more headlights cutting through the void. Victor Kane's reach was endless, his hunters relentless. For every man Ranger brought down, 2 more emerged. The ridge narrowed into a choke point, sheer cliffs yawning on either side. The wind screamed louder, a banshee trying to tear them from the earth. Lila clung to Daniel's arm, guiding him where the snow hid jagged drops. Almost there, she whispered, though her voice shook. She didn't know if it was true. She just knew she had to believe it. Behind Ranger, limped but refused to slow. His breaths came ragged, blood dripping steady with each stride. Yet his gaze never left the threat behind them. He wasn't running for himself. He was running for them. The storm closed tighter, suffocating the world. Flakes stung their eyes, ice clawed their throats. The headlights dimmed, swallowed by the white. For a moment, the gunfire faded. Silence pressed in, broken only by their gasps and the storm's endless howl. But Daniel knew silence in war. Silence was never safety. Silence was the inhale before the strike. He tightened his grip on Lila's hand. "Don't stop," he growled. "Not now." And in that moment, he understood the truth. They weren't just running from men. They were running from something bigger, a machine of power that would grind them into ash if they faltered. He didn't know why Victor Kane wanted them erased, didn't know how Ranger tied into it, didn't know why this girl carried fire in her veins. But he knew one thing, with the clarity of a soldier's survival, meant resistance. And resistance started with one step forward. So they ran into the storm, into the suffocating white, into the heart of the hunt. The cabin they stumbled into was no sanctuary. Just 4 walls of rotting timber, a roof that rattled with every gust of wind, and a fireplace long dead of flame. Yet compared to the storm clawing at the world outside, it was a fragile cocoon. Daniel collapsed against the wall, breath tearing in and out of his chest. His body was a map of pain, stitched together by sheer will. Lila knelt beside him, panic etched into every line of her face. She reached for the dog first, her small hands brushing over Ranger's torn flank. Blood seeped, staining her fingers. "You saved us," she whispered. Her voice trembled as if she was afraid the storm might steal the words away. Ranger met her gaze. And for the briefest instant, something passed between them. Not instinct. Not animal need. Something heavier, older. His eyes flickered with shadows of things Lila could not name but could feel. Memories that didn't belong in the gaze of a dog. Daniel saw it too. His jaw tightened. He had seen that look before, not in animals, but in soldiers. Men who had lived through firestorms of violence and carried the battlefield inside their skulls forever. He dragged in a breath. "You want the truth?" His voice was hoarse, jagged, as if each word scraped against stone. "Then you need to understand what he is. What they made him." Lila frowned. "Made him?" Daniel's gaze shifted to Ranger, who sat rigid, eyes locked on the boarded window, as though he could see through the storm. The soldier's voice lowered, heavy with memory. His name wasn't always Ranger. To the Army, he was Unit 7-3, part of a program called Echo Hound. The name itself seemed to thicken the air. Echo Hound. a phrase soaked in secrecy and buried history. Lila didn't move. Her breath frosted in front of her lips, but she forgot the cold. Daniel's eyes darkened. Echo Hound was more than training, more than obedience. They were experimenting with memory transfer, implanting fragments of battlefield experience into canines. Combat recall recognition, tactical response. The goal was to create dogs that didn't just react, but remembered. Soldiers in fur carrying the instincts of war. His words fell like stones one after another. They thought it would save lives. Dogs that knew the sound of an ambush before it happened. Dogs that could detect an IED because somewhere in their head, they remembered the blast. They weren't supposed to have consciousness, not the way we do, but they were supposed to have ghosts. Fragments. Enough to make them faster, sharper, more lethal. Lila shook her head, her face pale. That's impossible. Daniel gave a hollow laugh, though it was stripped of humor. That's what I thought too, until I saw it. His gaze dropped to Ranger. The dog had not moved. His body trembled not from the cold, but as if some internal storm rattled him deeper than flesh. His eyes were fixed on the window, still unblinking, and then it happened. The sound of the storm outside shifted a low groan in the timber frame that echoed like distant gunfire. Ranger flinched violently. His head snapped ears, pinning back his whole body, lowering into a crouch. A growl vibrated from his chest, but his eyes were not seeing the cabin anymore. Daniel's voice tightened. He remembers. Lila's breath caught. Remembers what? The air seemed to warp. Ranger's body shook, jaws clenching. His pupils dilated, as if the room had been replaced by another world, only he could see. And in the flicker of his gaze, Lila imagined it too. Visions not her own images burned into the dog's bones. Smoke. Men screaming in languages she didn't understand. The thunder of rotors, the crash of mortars tearing the night apart. Boots pounding across sand. And above it all, the sharp commanding voice of a man. Victor Kane. The moment his face carved itself into Ranger's memory, the dog released a howl, raw and guttural, as if the recognition itself tore him apart. He lunged at the door, clawing, snarling, desperate to reach something that wasn't there. His body was in the cabin, but his mind was trapped in another war. Lila backed against the wall, heart hammering. What's happening to him? Daniel forced himself upright, despite the pain shredding his ribs. His eyes were grim, but not surprised. He's not just a dog, Lila. He's a living witness. Every battle, every command, every face burned into him. And Victor Kane. Victor wasn't just funding the program. He was there. He gave the orders. The name fell heavy between them. Lila stared, disbelief tangled with horror. You're saying he knows Victor? Daniel nodded slowly. Not like you or I would. But deep down, in whatever twisted corner of memory they left inside him, he knows. He remembers the man who turned him into this. Outside, the storm battered the cabin's snow, clawing at the windows like a living thing. But inside, the storm was worse. Lila looked at Ranger, at his trembling body locked in battle with invisible demons. And something inside her cracked. She had thought he was just brave, just loyal. But he was more than that. He was scarred, haunted, carrying burdens no living creature should bear. And he had saved them anyway. Tears blurred her vision. She crawled toward him, whispering softly, Ranger, it's okay. You're here. You're not there anymore. Her hand touched his fur, warm beneath the blood. Slowly, painfully, the tremors in his body eased. His growl faded to a whimper, his eyes flickering back to the present. He sagged against her, exhausted but alive. Daniel watched something raw flickering across his face. He had seen men break under the weight of memory. Yet this creature, this dog, had carried it and still chosen to fight. He's the key, Daniel murmured. The words barely left his lips, but they carried the weight of revelation. Victor wants him silenced, because if the truth ever came out, if the world knew Echo Hound was real, that they put ghosts into these animals, it would bury him. Lila tightened her arms around Ranger, holding him as though she could shield him from shadows. She felt his heartbeat against her chest, steady but scarred. Then we can't let him take him. Not again. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to meet her gaze. Behind her fear was something else, a resolve as sharp as the storm outside. He saw the same fire that had dragged him from the wreckage, the same defiance that stood against bullets. You understand what that means? He asked. His voice was low, grave. She nodded. It means he's not just our protector. He's evidence. He's truth. And if Victor wants to erase him, Then we make sure the world hears his story first. The words hung there, reckless and impossible. Yet Daniel felt the faintest pull of something he hadn't allowed himself in years believe. But he also knew the cost. Victor Kane wasn't a man who lost. He wasn't a man who forgave. And now, with Ranger as the living embodiment of a secret that should have stayed buried, the hunt would not stop. Daniel shifted, grimacing against the pain. Then we'll need to move. Tonight. The longer we stay, the closer they get. Lila stroked Ranger's head, whispering softly. The dog's eyes, though weary, had steadied. And in them, she saw not just the soldier they had forced him to be, but the survivor he had chosen to become. For the first time, she understood Ranger wasn't simply an animal. He was a witness, a victim, and a warrior, all in one. A being trapped between the innocence of what he was born as and the brutality of what he had been turned into. And now he was theirs to protect. The fire outside howled louder, as if reminding them that time was short. Daniel pushed himself upright, every movement etched with pain. Lila helped steady him. Ranger limped to the door, ears alert once more, not broken, not defeated, but braced for the storm. The cabins shuddered, as if the world itself conspired to silence them. But inside, something had shifted. Truth had been dragged from the shadows. And though it weighed heavy, it gave shape to their fight. Lila pressed her forehead against Ranger's, closing her eyes. We'll carry it together, she whispered. The dog exhaled a low rumble that sounded almost like agreement, and for a fleeting moment, despite the storm, despite the hunters circling beyond the white, despite the weight of secrets that could shatter nations, the three of them stood not as fugitives, but as something stronger. A soldier, a girl, and a haunted hound, bound by memory and defiance. The storm would not wait. Neither would Victor. But now they knew what they carried. And now they knew why they had to survive. The storm had not let up. Snow swept across the Montana wilderness with relentless force, burying tracks, erasing paths, smothering the land in a white silence that seemed endless. But for Lila Anderson, trudging forward with numb feet and burning lungs, there was no silence inside. Her mind had become a storm of its own, louder and sharper than the one tearing through the trees. Every step she took beside Daniel Moore, who staggered and leaned heavily on her shoulder, and Ranger, whose wounded gait left streaks of crimson against the snow, pulled memories from a place she had locked away for years. Memories she had tried to kill inside her heart, but tonight they clawed themselves back to life. It began with a sound, the crunch of Ranger's paws on ice that pulled her back to another night. A night much warmer, but heavy with fear. She saw herself younger, curled under a blanket listening to her mother's voice. A soft voice, insistent, speaking about things Lila hadn't understood back then. Words like corruption, Victor Kane cover-up, and truth. Her mother had been a journalist, bold and fearless, with eyes that shone when she talked about justice. She had promised Lila that the truth always found its way out, even if people tried to bury it. But soon after those promises had vanished with the suddenness of screeching tires and shattered glass. The official story had called it an accident. A slick road. A broken guardrail. A single mother gone in a flash of twisted metal. Lila had cried herself numb, clinging to the explanation adults had fed her because she was too young, too powerless to question it. But now, as Daniel struggled beside her, and Ranger's ears flicked at sounds and the storm fragments began snapping together in her mind like pieces of a cruel puzzle. Daniel had muttered Victor's name before, his voice tight with the recognition of someone who knew what powerful men were capable of. And Victor's men had hunted them relentless, as though silencing a girl and a wounded dog were matters of life and death. Why? Why chase them with such ferocity, unless her breath caught frosting in the air? The memory was vivid now. Her mother's desk cluttered with files, grainy photographs of mining sites, financial ledgers with pages marked in red, a name scrawled in the margins, Victor Kane. Her mother had been chasing a story too dangerous for the world to hear, and Lila's blood ran cold with the dawning truth her mother hadn't died by accident. She had been silenced. The snow whipped harder, as though the world itself was reacting to Lila's realization. Her legs faltered, but she clenched her fists until her nails bit into her palms, steadying herself with anger. The grief that had once drowned her now twisted into something sharper. Her mother hadn't left her. Her mother had been taken, stolen. And Victor Kane had been the thief. Daniel stumbled, coughing blood into the snow, and Lila tightened her grip under his arm, refusing to let him fall. He glanced at her through hazy eyes, but in his face she saw something that startled her recognition. It was faint, but when his gaze lingered on her features, she realized he wasn't seeing her. He was seeing echoes of someone else. Her mother. "Your eyes." Daniel rasped the words, nearly lost in the storm. Lila's heart lurched. No one had ever said that to her before, but she knew. She had her mother's eyes. Eyes that once looked into the abyss of corruption and dared to confront it. Ranger let out a low growl, halting in the snow body tense. His ears tilted back, nose twitching toward the shadows. He remembered too. Lila could see it in the way his body quivered, not just from cold or pain, but from memory. The dog carried the scars of war, the ghosts of the Echo Hound Project, and somewhere in those embedded memories was the face of Victor Kane. Ranger was more than a dog now. He was a vessel of truth, just as her mother's notes had been. And suddenly Lila understood the weight pressing on her shoulders wasn't just survival. It was justice. She wasn't simply running from Victor Kane anymore. She was running toward the truth. He had stolen the truth her mother had died for. Her chest rose and fell with a mix of terror and determination. She was 13, a runaway, fragile and unprepared. Yet in that moment, her grief shifted into a vow. She would not let her mother's death be a forgotten accident buried under paperwork and lies. She would not let Ranger's suffering be just another scar in a long history of secrets. She would fight. Not just for herself, but for her mother, for Ranger, and maybe even for Daniel, whose broken body still clung to life because she had dragged him from fire and steel. The storm howled, but Lila's mind grew eerily clear. She could almost hear her mother's voice again, whispering like the wind through the trees. "Don't let them bury the truth, Lila. You're stronger than you know." Daniel groaned, his legs buckling again, and she and Ranger braced him, guiding him forward. The snow seemed endless, but Lila's steps became steadier. With every stride, her mother's death transformed from a wound into a weapon. She no longer felt like prey. She felt like someone who carried a torch through the blizzard, a spark of justice waiting to ignite. Ranger pressed closer to her, his flank brushing hers. His breath steamed his amber eyes, locking with hers, in a moment of unspoken understanding. He too bore memories too heavy for a creature his kind should endure. But together they carried the past forward, two survivors bound by secrets that could topple a tyrant. For the first time since fleeing the orphanage, Lila's fear didn't consume her. It fueled her. Every crunch of her boots in the snow sounded like a drumbeat. Every gust of wind tore at her face like a dare. And in the hollow of her chest, where grief once hollowed her out, something stronger now burned the demand for justice. She whispered into the storm a vow too soft for Daniel to hear, but not for herself. "I'll finish what you started, Mom. I swear I will." The Montana night swallowed her words, but they lingered inside her, brighter than the storm's fury. Lila Anderson was no longer just a runaway. She was a daughter carrying the fire of a silenced mother, a child bonded to a wounded soldier of fur and blood, and together they would turn grief into a reckoning. The storm could bury their tracks. Victor Kane could send armies of men. But the past had risen, and Lila would not let it die again. The wind roared through the broken timbers of the forest, shaking the snow off skeletal branches and carrying it in sheets across the clearing. Lila could barely feel her hands anymore. She kept them pressed under Daniel's arm, supporting his weight as he stumbled forward, his breath rasping, leaving a trail of dark blood across the frozen crust of the earth. Ranger trotted close, his ears pricked, his body rigid with a soldier's instinct. There was danger ahead. Lila didn't need words to feel it. It was in the way Ranger's hackles rose and in the way Daniel stiffened despite his pain. The outline of the cabin appeared through the storm. An old log house abandoned long ago, the roof sagging beneath heavy snow. To Lila, it looked like shelter, a place where maybe Daniel could rest, where she could breathe for the first time in hours. But Ranger froze before the threshold. His teeth bared a growl rising low in his chest. And then she saw them. Shadows first. Figures slipping out from behind the skeletal frame of the cabin. 3, then 4, then 6. Men in heavy coats, their faces hidden by scarves and goggles, rifles slung across their shoulders. Victor's men. The storm hissed around them, but silence pressed in tight. Lila's pulse hammered so hard she thought it might split her ribs. She tightened her grip on Daniel, who managed to straighten, forcing his battered body upright. His face was pale lips blue, but his eyes were clear with a soldier's focus. They were trapped. The men had them boxed in, and Lila knew there would be no running this time. The first voice cut through the blizzard, harsh and taunting. "End of the line, girl. Hand over the mutt, and maybe we'll let you crawl out of here alive." Ranger's growl turned into a snarl, teeth flashing white in the dim light. Lila shifted her back, pressed to the cabin's rough wall, eyes darting for anything she could use. Her breath steamed in the air as fear clawed at her throat, but beneath it burned something harder. She remembered her mother's fire, remembered her vow. She would not surrender. Daniel leaned close, his voice hoarse but sharp. Listen to me, kid. When they move, you move. Ranger and I will hit first. You find a way to slow them down. Her heart leapt into her throat. She wanted to scream at him, that he could barely stand, that his blood painted the snow. But his eyes left no room for argument. He was a soldier, broken but unyielding. The men advanced. Boots crunched over the snow. Lila felt her body coil, every nerve strung tight like wire. Then the storm erupted into violence. Ranger lunged first. His body became a blur of fur and muscle, slamming into the nearest man with bone-cracking force. The scream was muffled by the storm as the man toppled, his rifle spinning away. Blood sprayed as Ranger's jaws locked onto an arm, tearing through cloth and flesh. Daniel followed with the fury of a dying man who refused to bow. He seized the fallen rifle, swinging it like a club into another attacker's face. Bones shattered under the blow, and Daniel turned the weapon around, firing a wild shot that sent sparks of flame into the snow. Lila moved because she had no choice. The cabin wall behind her had half-rotted timbers brittle with age. She yanked at them with frozen fingers, ripping free splinters and beams, dragging them into a rough barricade across the doorway. She remembered her mother teaching her how to stack firewood, how to wedge pieces so they wouldn't fall. Now she shoved them into place, not for warmth, but to buy seconds, maybe minutes. The storm became a chaos of screams, snarls, gunfire. A man lunged for her through the broken window, his gloved hand seizing her coat. Lila screamed, slamming a jagged plank of wood into his face. His goggles cracked, blood spattering against the glass. He recoiled with a roar, and Ranger was there, launching up, dragging him down into the snow. Daniel fired again, the recoil knocking him to his knees. He gritted his teeth, blood dripping from his mouth. His eyes flicked to Lila, urging her to keep moving. She stumbled inside the cabin, dragging Daniel with her, as Ranger fought at the door. The walls groaned with the assault of boots and fists as the men tried to break through. The air reeked of sweat, blood, gunpowder. Lila's lungs burned, her body trembling, but her mind raced. There had to be something here, something she could use. Her eyes darted across the ruined room, broken furniture, rotting rafters, hunting traps rusted with age. Her fingers closed around a coil of wire, jagged but strong. A plan, half-formed, took root in her desperation. She dragged the wire across the doorway, anchoring it between the broken beams she had stacked. Her fingers bled as she twisted it tight, forming a crude snare. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The door crashed open. Two men surged inside, guns raised. Now Daniel roared, forcing himself upright. Ranger exploded from the shadows, his body slamming into one man's chest, driving him back against the jagged wire. The man screamed as the trap caught him, slicing through his coat, holding him fast. Daniel swung the rifle like a spear, ramming the buttstock into the second man's gut. The cabin filled with chaos, shouts, the crack of gunfire, Ranger's snarls echoing like thunder. Lila seized a rusted lantern from the table, hurling it into the fray. It shattered against the floor flames, leaping where oil splashed across the rotted wood. Firelight danced across the snow as the storm howled through broken windows. "Go!" Daniel shouted, shoving her toward the back. His face was ghostly pale, sweat dripping down his brow. But his voice carried a command that brooked no argument. Lila scrambled toward the rear wall, kicking at the rotted boards until they gave way, opening a path into the storm. She pulled Daniel through Ranger, following his muzzle stained dark with blood. They spilled into the snow, the fire behind them, consuming the cabin, devouring the screams of the trapped men. The night swallowed them whole, the storm hiding their flight once more. But Daniel staggered, his body collapsing into the snow. Lila caught him, her knees buckling under his weight. His wound had torn deeper in the fight, blood soaking through his coat, steaming in the cold. His breaths came shallow, ragged. "Stay with me," she begged, her voice breaking. "Please, Daniel. Don't you dare leave me now." He tried to smile, but it twisted into a grimace. "You did good, kid. You did damn good." His words faded into a cough, red spraying across the snow. Ranger pressed close, whining low, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his eyes locked on Daniel with fierce loyalty. The storm raged around them, hiding their escape. But the truth was clear. Daniel was fading, slipping further with every drop of blood that soaked into the white earth. Lila clutched him tighter, her chest heaving with terror. She had survived the first clash, had fought like her mother would have wanted. But survival had come at a price. The cabin behind them burned flames, clawing at the night sky, a beacon of war in the wilderness. Victor's men would not stop. They would regroup, they would follow, and the next battle would be worse. But in Lila's heart, fear hardened into steel. She looked at Daniel's face, pale and broken, and at Ranger's eyes still burning with the fight. They had survived their first confrontation. They would survive the next. Because giving up was no longer an option. Not for her, not for them, not for the truth her mother had died to protect. The storm had softened for the first time in hours, as though the sky itself had exhausted its rage. The flames from the ruined cabin behind them were distant now, a faint orange glow swallowed by snow and distance. The three of them, Daniel, Lila, and Ranger, had found refuge beneath a cluster of bent pines that curved together like a dome, shielding them from the bitter wind. It wasn't much, but for now, it was enough. Lila sat with her back against the tree trunk, Daniel's head resting against her lap. His face was gray and the half-light beads of sweat frozen against his skin. She pressed the torn remains of her scarf into the wound on his side, trying to slow the bleeding. Her hands were slick with his blood, her throat raw from fear, but she refused to let herself break. She had already lost too much. She couldn't lose him too. Ranger lay beside them, chest heaving, his fur matted with blood that wasn't his own. His golden brown eyes flicked between the two humans, haunted, sorrowful, but steady. He pressed his body closer to Daniel's side, as though sheer will might keep the man alive. For a long while, the only sounds were the wind, threading through the trees, and the ragged rasp of Daniel's breathing. Lila's own chest ached with every inhale he took, as if her body had synced with his fight to keep living. She didn't even realize tears had frozen on her cheeks until Daniel stirred. "Kid," he rasped, his voice shredded. She leaned closer. "I'm here. Don't talk, just rest." But he shook his head weakly, forcing his eyes open. Those eyes, so weary but so steady, locked on hers. "No. Listen." She wanted to argue, wanted to silence him, but there was something in the way he spoke that made her still. She knew instinctively these were words he had carried for too long. Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze drifting upward through the cracks in the pine canopy. Snowflakes caught the faint light as they fell fragile and fleeting. "I had a daughter once," he whispered. Her name was Grace. The name hung in the air, trembling with the weight of memory. She was everything, he went on, his voice breaking. Smart, stubborn, had a laugh that could tear down walls. I used to think I'd spend the rest of my life protecting her. But one night, his breath hitched and his jaw tightened as though forcing the words through a locked gate. One night I wasn't there. A drunk driver. She was gone before I even made it to the hospital. Lila's hands froze where they pressed against his wound. The world seemed to tilt beneath her, the storm outside dimming in comparison to the storm unraveling inside this broken man. She had seen Daniel fight like a soldier, had seen him tear through Victor's men with sheer defiance. But now his strength was stripped bare, and what remained was a father hollowed by loss. "I tried to bury it," Daniel said, voice raw. "Tried to bury myself in the job, in the bottle, in anything that would keep me from remembering her smile. But the truth is, I died that night too. Just kept walking around pretending I was still alive." His eyes turned back to Lila, and she flinched at the intensity there. "And then you showed up. This stubborn, reckless girl who refuses to quit no matter how bad it gets. Every time I look at you, I see Grace. Not just her face, but her spirit. The fire in her." Lila's chest tightened so fiercely she thought it might shatter. She shook her head, her voice breaking. "I'm not her. I can't be her." "I know," Daniel said softly. "And I'm not asking you to be. But I need you to know what you've given me. For the first time in years, I don't feel like a ghost. I feel like a father again." The words cut through her like a blade, but not in pain, in recognition. Because she knew that emptiness too. She had lived her whole life carrying the shadow of a mother taken too soon and a father who had never cared to see her. She had walked through this world, believing she was unworthy of being loved, unworthy of belonging. And now, here was this broken man, bleeding out in her lap, giving her the one thing she had craved, more than anything else, a place in someone's heart. Her vision blurred. She didn't fight it this time. The tears came in heavy, shaking sobs that cracked her open. "I've been alone my whole life," she choked out. I thought that was all I'd ever have. Just me fighting, running, surviving. But with you... She broke off her words, lost to the storm in her chest. Daniel reached up his bloodied hand, trembling, and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. You're not alone anymore, kid. Not as long as I'm breathing. Ranger let out a low whine, pressing closer, as if to remind them both that he too was part of this fragile circle. His eyes glimmered in the faint light eyes that had seen more than any creature should, eyes that carried their own grief and yet refused to let go of loyalty. For the first time, Lila saw it clearly. They were three souls shattered by loss, wandering through a storm that wanted to consume them. And yet by some cruel twist of fate, or maybe by mercy, they had found each other. She leaned down, resting her forehead against Daniel's. Then promise me, she whispered. Promise me you'll hold on. I can't lose you too. His breath hitched, but his eyes stayed on hers, fierce despite the pain. I promise. They sat like that, locked in a vow born of desperation, until Lila's sobs quieted and Daniel's breathing steadied into a fragile rhythm. The storm outside pressed on, but within the shelter of the pines, a new silence took root. Not the silence of fear or despair, but the silence of belonging. For the first time since her mother's death, Lila felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like family. She reached out her hand, finding Ranger's thick fur, and he leaned into her touch with a sigh, his eyes closing as though he too could rest at last. The three of them huddled together, bound not by blood, but by loss, by defiance, by the fragile thread of hope. A soldier without his daughter, a girl without her parents, a dog torn from everything he had known. Alone, each of them had been broken. Together, they were something stronger. As the fire in the distance faded and the night deepened, Lila realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't destined to walk this world alone anymore. And in that fragile, fleeting peace, a family was born. The storm had slowed to a steady whisper by the time Daniel's breathing steadied enough for him to sit upright. The blood loss had drained the color from his face. But in his eyes, those hard soldier's eyes, something had begun to ignite. Lila saw it the moment his hand clenched into a fist, his jaw tightening against the ache in his ribs. He wasn't thinking about rest anymore. He wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about Victor. She recognized the look even before he spoke. Rage, sharpened by grief. Determination forged from the ruins of despair. It terrified her because she knew it meant he wasn't done fighting, not even close. Daniel braced himself against the tree, drawing in a shuddering breath. We can't keep running, he said, his voice hoarse but steady. Not from him, not from what he's planning. Lila froze. What do you mean? We don't have a choice. He's got men everywhere, and you're... Her words caught as her gaze dropped to the blood-soaked bandages at his side. You're barely holding on. Daniel's hand tightened around the hilt of the knife he'd managed to keep the steel catching faint moonlight. Running only gives him more time. Time to bury what he's done. Time to hurt more people. Ranger shifted beside him, ears pricking his body alert, as though he understood the gravity of the moment. The dog's steady gaze locked on Daniel, and for a fleeting second Lila thought she saw an agreement pass between them, an unspoken oath that whatever came next, Ranger would stand beside him. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled scrap of paper smeared with blood. He handed it to Lila. When I broke into his safe house last month, before all this, I found this. She smoothed it open with trembling fingers. It was a rough map, scrawled in haste. Her eyes caught on the words scratched across the top, Northridge Mine. She looked up, confusion clouding her face. This is miles from here. Why would he? Because it's abandoned? Daniel cut in. Old mineral site condemned after a cave-in. No one goes near it. Perfect place to stash what he doesn't want anyone to find. Her pulse quickened as she traced the lines of the map. The documents? Daniel nodded grimly. All of it. Bank transfers, blueprints, proof of his network. Enough to bring him down. But that's not all. His voice dropped lower, almost to a growl. He's rigged the place. Explosives. If we don't get there first, he'll bury every trace. And then he'll start again somewhere else. Lila felt her chest tighten, fear gnawing at her resolve. So what you want us to just walk into his trap? Daniel leaned forward, his gaze burning. No. I want us to end this, once and for all. The words hung in the air like a spark ready to catch. Lila swallowed hard, the enormity pressing down on her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to cling to whatever fragile safety they had left. But another voice, quieter, deeper, rose from within. It was the same voice that had kept her alive through every night on the streets, every close call. The voice that said survival wasn't enough if it meant letting the world burn around her. Her eyes lifted to meet Daniel's, and she saw more than resolve there. She saw desperation. He wasn't just trying to bring Victor down, he was trying to stop history from repeating itself. His daughter's death still haunted him every second of every day. If Victor succeeded, it would mean more Graces, more shattered lives. Lila's voice trembled, but she forced the words out. If we do this, if we go after him, there's no going back. Daniel's reply was immediate, his tone raw. There's nothing to go back to. Silence fell between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the steady rhythm of Ranger's breathing. Lila reached out her hand, settling on the dog's fur. His warmth grounded her, reminded her she wasn't alone anymore. Slowly she nodded. Then we do it together. Something shifted in Daniel's expression, an ache, an unspoken gratitude. But he didn't waste time with words. He pressed a hand to her shoulder, solid and grounding, before turning his gaze toward the dark horizon. We'll need a plan, he said. The three of them huddled closer, their bodies bent against the cold, their whispers mixing with the sigh of the wind. Daniel outlined what he remembered of the mine, a main shaft sealed decades ago. A side entrance hidden by rock falls, the storage shed still standing on the ridge. He described the likely placement of the charges. Victor's men would line the tunnels with dynamite connected to a remote trigger. Lila listened, her mind racing. She was quick, faster than she gave herself credit for. Where Daniel thought in terms of combat, she thought in terms of traps, misdirection, survival. She remembered the crude snares she'd built to survive on the streets, the ways she'd learned to turn her weakness into an advantage. Her mind began sketching possibilities, turning Daniel's grim outline into a path forward. We can't take him head on, she whispered. Not with his men, not with your injury. But if we can get inside first, if we can reach the detonators, we can flip this on him. Daniel's eyes narrowed, considering. Use his own explosives against him, she nodded. Make him walk into his own destruction. For the first time that night, a faint smile ghosted across Daniel's lips. It wasn't joy, not even close, but it was something like hope. Smart kid. The plan was desperate and fragile, and laced with risk at every turn. But as the pieces took shape, the fear inside Lila began to change. It was still there, yes, but beneath it was something steadier. Purpose. Ranger shifted suddenly, ears tilting back toward the tree line. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Instantly, both Daniel and Lila fell silent. They waited tense, but after a long moment, nothing came. Only the whisper of wind and snow. Still, the reminder was clear. Time was short. Victor's men could be anywhere closing in. Daniel forced himself to his feet, swaying but refusing to fall. We move before dawn, he said. If we wait, we lose the chance. Lila stood beside him, her small frame dwarfed by his, but her resolve no less fierce. She tightened her grip on the map, on the fragile thread of hope they carried. If we don't stop him, she said softly, almost to herself, then everything we've been through, all of it, will mean nothing. Daniel turned to her, his face etched with scars of grief and battle. His voice, when it came, was low, but unbreakable. Then we make sure it means something. We end this. Together. Ranger barked once, sharp and decisive, as though sealing the vow. And in that moment, the three of them, an ex-soldier, a lost girl, and a dog scarred by loyalty, became more than survivors. They became a family bound by purpose. They knew the risks. They knew the cost. But as they turned their eyes toward the mine, toward Victor, toward the firestorm waiting ahead, none of them flinched. Because sometimes survival isn't enough. Sometimes the only way forward is through the fire, and they were ready to burn. The mine loomed before them, like the mouth of some ancient beast, a jagged maw carved into the side of the mountain. The moonlight barely reached the ridge, swallowed by shadows that seemed to thicken around the abandoned structures. Rusted conveyor belts jutted into the sky like broken bones. The air reeked faintly of oil and damp stone, carrying with it the memory of sweat dust and death. Daniel tightened the strap around his injured side, suppressing the groan that threatened to escape. He could feel the wound reopening with every breath, but he didn't slow. Pain was a currency he'd long grown used to spending. Tonight it would be the last thing Victor took from him. Beside him, Lila's small frame trembled, though not from cold. Her eyes darted across the terrain, sharp and calculating, taking in every possible route, every cover of shadow. She had grown in the past hours, no longer just a runaway clinging to survival, but someone who understood the weight of what they were about to do. Her fear was real. Yes, but so was her resolve. Ranger crouched low, his body a taut coil of muscle and instinct. His ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring at every faint sound. The dog had fought alongside Daniel before, but tonight his role would be more than teeth and strength. He was their distraction, their phantom in the dark, the one who would carve open seconds where none existed. From the cliffs above, the mine stretched like a graveyard of industry. The main shaft gaped wide, reinforced with beams long since eaten by rust. Scaffolding wrapped the structures in skeletal frames, ladders, and platforms, groaning under the weight of silence. But beneath the hush of abandonment was something new. Electric light, faint but deliberate. Victor's men had been here, stringing wires, planning charges, turning the ruins into a death trap. And at the heart of it stood Victor himself. They saw him before he saw them. A broad figure in a tailored coat, incongruously clean against the grime. His silver hair gleamed even in the gloom. His stance relaxed, but exuding the calm menace of a man utterly in control. Around him, armed guards patrolled in loose formation rifles, gleaming boots crunching against gravel. Their ease wasn't laziness, it was confidence born of the belief that no one would dare step into this place. Daniel's jaw clenched as his eyes fixed on Victor. The man had aged, but power preserved him. There was no trace of guilt in the way he carried himself. No shadow of the lives crushed under his schemes. Only certainty, only command. Lila's whisper broke the silence between them. "He's waiting for someone." Daniel nodded grimly. "He's waiting for us." The words weren't bravado. They were truth. Victor knew they'd come. The mine was not just a vault of evidence, it was bait, a stage set for confrontation. And yet Daniel felt no urge to turn back. If anything, the certainty clarified him. He knelt, drawing Lila and Ranger close. His voice was low-clipped, soldier-sharp. "Listen, we don't have numbers. We don't have firepower. What we have is timing. We hit fast, we hit quiet. Ranger draws them off. Lila, you get inside the sheds, find the files, the drives, whatever you can carry. I'll keep Victor occupied." Lila's eyes widened. "Alone, you can barely—" "Alone." Daniel cut her off, steel in his tone. "He wants me. That buys you time. Don't argue. You've got the only chance to get proof out of here." The silence that followed was thick with dread, but also with acceptance. Lila nodded, though her hand trembled as it brushed Ranger's fur. "Okay. Just don't die." Daniel almost smiled, though it was grim hollow. Not tonight. They moved like shadows down the ridge, every step measured against gravel's betrayals. The mine grew larger, its machinery looming above them, like the ribs of some mechanical god. The hum of generators carried faintly, and the flicker of lamps lit narrow cones across the ground. At the first checkpoint, Daniel signaled. Ranger slipped forward, a streak of dark muscle. A guard barely had time to register the growl before the dog slammed into him, teeth sinking into his arm. The man's weapon clattered to the dirt, his shout echoing across the yard. Chaos bloomed instantly, two more guards rushing to help, shouts ricocheting off the walls. Daniel's hand shot out, pushing Lila toward the shadows. "Go." She darted left, vanishing into the labyrinth of scaffolding and sheds. Daniel, meanwhile, broke cover deliberately. He wanted Victor's eyes on him, and he got them. The crime lord's head lifted as Daniel strode into the open, shoulders squared, despite the pain burning in his side. For a heartbeat, Victor's expression shifted. Not surprise, not fear, but recognition. Then he smiled. Well, Victor's voice rang out smooth and cold. The ghost walks into his own grave. The guards fanned out, rifles aimed, but Victor lifted a hand. He wanted this slow. He wanted Daniel to feel every ounce of futility. Daniel stopped 10 paces away, his knife glinting in one hand, his other pressed lightly against his wound. His voice carried across the space, hoarse but unshaken. "You should have stayed buried." Victor's chuckle was low, condescending. "And you should have stayed broken. But you never learn, do you? Always clawing, always fighting. For what, justice?" He spat the word like it was poison. "Justice is what men like me buy and sell." Daniel said nothing. Words were smoke. He needed Victor talking, distracted. Somewhere behind the sheds, Lila was moving, slipping between shadows, pressing her small frame against corrugated steel. She found a door, its padlock weak with rust. Her fingers shook as she worked it loose, praying the creak didn't carry. Inside the shed reeked of dust and diesel. Wooden crates stacked, high tarps draped across forgotten machinery. But there, on a metal table under the harsh glow of a lamp, sat the prize. Folders, ledgers, hard drives, all neatly bound, as though waiting for her. She darted forward, heart hammering, shoving documents into her pack. Every second felt stolen, each breath borrowed. Back outside, Ranger tore through the yard, weaving between guards, forcing them to split, to stumble, to fire wild. Bullets sparked against steel beams ringing through the hollow mine. His growls cut sharp through the chaos, a phantom no man could pin down. Daniel advanced another step, knife steady, his eyes never leaving Victor's. "This ends tonight." Victor's smile widened, cruel. "Yes," he said softly. Then raising his voice, "Do it." A flash of red light blinked from the scaffolding above. Daniel barely registered it before a detonation roared, not the mine collapsing, but a controlled blast. An explosion lit the night, showering sparks as a section of catwalk disintegrated. Fire licked upward, bathing the scene in hellish glow. The message was clear, Victor wasn't bluffing. The mine was wired, the detonators live, and one wrong step would bury them all. But Daniel didn't flinch. Pain, fire, death, all of it meant nothing if Lila got those files out. He shifted his stance, blade raised, and for the first time in years, he felt something almost pure clarity. Victor descended the steps toward him, slow and deliberate, the guards keeping their rifles trained, but their eyes wary. The air between the two men thickened, not with smoke, but with the gravity of history. This wasn't just about tonight. It was about every life destroyed, every truth buried. And in the shadows, with her bag, heavy with stolen proof and her heart thundering, Lila whispered to herself the words that had carried her this far. "Don't get caught. Don't look back. Don't stop." The mine was alive now, lights blazing, fire cracking, shouts rising. The trap had been sprung, but so had their chance. Every heartbeat was borrowed. Every breath was stolen. And the night was far from over. The snow began to fall harder. Thick, heavy flakes tumbling through the air as if the storm itself had been waiting for this moment. It came down in sheets, swallowing the mountainside in a furious white, yet beneath that blanket of winter fire clawed upward an unholy marriage of ice and flame. The Minyard erupted into chaos the instant Victor pressed the detonator. A muffled click, and then the world-convulsed thunder cracking from the earth's bowels. The scaffolding trembled, girders snapped, and walls of sparks fountained into the night. Smoke poured from the detonated charges, billowing black against the glowing snow, choking the air with the stench of sulfur and burning metal. Daniel staggered under the shockwave, his ribs flaring with white-hot agony, as though the blast had reached inside his body to twist him apart. He forced himself upright, teeth-bared, eyes fixed on Victor's silhouette through the haze. The crime lord stood firm, coat billowing in the gusts, face lit by the flicker of fire and the glint of falling snow. A conductor orchestrating destruction with cruel precision. "End of the line," Soldier Victor called, his voice cutting through the storm, both mocking and triumphant. "You crawl all this way, and for what? To die in the dirt like the rest." Daniel tightened his grip on the knife, but his vision blurred for a split second. Pain and blood loss were winning, threatening to drag him down. He heard distantly the bark and snarl of Ranger as the dog tore through a pair of guards. The sound snapped Daniel back, anchoring him. This wasn't just about him anymore. Through the smoke, Ranger launched himself at one of Victor's men, clamping down on the man's wrist, dragging him to the ground with feral determination. Another guard swung a rifle like a club, cracking it across Ranger's flank. But the dog did not yield. He twisted, teeth flashing, taking the man down in a spray of snow and blood. Ranger's growls echoed primal, unstoppable buying seconds that no human could have claimed. Daniel lunged forward, blade raised, but a guard intercepted him. The clash was brutal, and raw fists, steel, and desperation. Daniel drove the knife upward, but his opponent twisted, slamming him against a beam. His injured ribs screamed. For a moment, darkness crowded the edges of his vision, threatening to swallow him whole. "Stay up," he hissed to himself, forcing air into lungs that refused to expand. "Stay the hell up." A blur of movement caught his eye. Lila, small and defiant, emerging from the shadows of the shed. Her pack was bulging with stolen evidence, but she wasn't running. Not anymore. She clutched a length of iron chain rust, flaking under her white-knuckled grip. Her eyes locked on Victor. Victor turned, amusement flickering across his face as he spotted her. "Ah, the little rat. You've got teeth now, do you?" He stepped toward her, slow, deliberate, dismissing her as one might a child brandishing a stick. His guards tightened their circle, but his arrogance was absolute. Daniel tried to push toward her, but another guard slammed him back, forcing him to his knees. His knife slipped, skidding across the gravel. He cursed, powerless to stop what was unfolding. The snow thickened, a storm's fury swallowing light and sound. But Lila's voice cut through it, trembling, raw, yet steady. "You don't get to win, not after everything." Victor smirked, dismissive. "And what will you do, child, cry at me?" Lila swung. The chain whipped through the air, cracking like thunder as it struck Victor across the face. The sound echoed brutal, final. His head snapped back, blood blooming along his cheek where rusted steel tore flesh. Shock flickered across his features, not from pain, but from the realization that she had dared. Daniel's chest swelled, pride cutting through agony. For the first time, he saw not just the broken girl he'd been protecting, but the fighter she'd become. Victor roared, enraged, stumbling forward, reaching for her with bloodied hands. But Lila swung again, the chain wrapping around his arm, yanking with every ounce of strength she had. He staggered, cursing, his composure fracturing, as the storm howled around them. Ranger crashed into another guard, tackling him into a burning crate. Flames licked upward, the snow melting into steam as the chaos thickened. The dog's fur was matted with blood, now his sides heaving, but still he fought. Still he clawed for more time. Then Daniel saw it, the small cylindrical shape rolling across the gravel, the faint red blink of its timer. A bomb armed primed seconds from tearing the mine apart. His heart lurched into his throat. "Lila," he shouted, voice hoarse. "The charge?" Victor's smile twisted, grotesque, even under the blood. "Yes. Let her see what justice feels like." Daniel struggled against the guard, pinning him, but his body betrayed him, too weak to break free. Panic thundered through him as the blinking light grew faster, and then Ranger saw it. The dog broke from the fight, his body battered, his gait uneven. But his eyes locked on the device with a clarity that transcended instinct. He sprinted, limping, dragging, but unyielding, straight toward the blinking light. "No!" Lila screamed, voice raw, cracking as she dropped the chain. She lunged, reaching for him, but it was too late. Ranger clamped his jaws around the device, tearing it from the ground, and in one final bound hurled himself toward the farthest blaze, away from Lila, away from Daniel. His body vanished into the fire, swallowed by the inferno. The explosion ripped through the vineyard, a searing flash that turned the world white. Snow and flame collided, a deafening roar that shook the mountain to its bones. The blast threw Daniel to the ground, his ears ringing, his chest crushed by the concussive force. He tasted blood, thick and metallic, as his cheek pressed against the frozen dirt. All around the world was a blur of red light and falling snow, and then silence. Slow, staggering, Daniel pushed himself up, vision swimming. Across the chaos, he saw Lila on her knees in the snow, tears streaking down her soot-stained face. She was screaming, but the storm devoured her voice, twisting it into something primal, something beyond words. Her hands clawed at the air where Ranger had been, as though sheer will might drag him back from the blaze. Victor staggered as well, his face bloodied, his arrogance cracked. He looked at the inferno with wide eyes, realizing what had been sacrificed, what had been lost. For the first time, doubt shadowed his expression. Daniel forced himself upright, every fiber of his being howling in pain. But his eyes never left Victor. The man had lit the match, but Ranger had carried the flame. And now everything that followed would be paid in full. The snow kept falling soft and relentless, a cruel counterpoint to the violence below. It clung to Lila's lashes, melted into her tears, blurred the edges of the world, until all that remained was grief and fury. She clutched the chain still in her hands, its rust mingling with her blood. Her knuckles were raw, her body shaking, but her spirit was unbroken. Through the veil of tears, she fixed Victor with a gaze that could have frozen fire. The storm screamed with her, and the night once again was alive with war. The roar of the explosion still trembled through the mountains long after the fire dimmed. What had once been a monument to Victor's empire, a web of tunnels and smelters clawing into the earth, was now a broken carcass. Steel beams jutted from the snow like ribs of a dying beast. Smoke poured from collapsed shafts, and the ground itself seemed to groan under the weight of destruction. The storm pressed down, howling through the twisted wreckage, erasing outlines with sheets of snow. But nothing could cover the truth. The empire was dead, consumed by its own fire. Victor lay somewhere beneath it, buried in the ruins of his greed. The avalanche of collapsing stone and iron had swallowed him as the blast ripped through the foundation. No last speech, no defiant escape, only the earth reclaiming what he had stolen. The storm did not mourn him. The fire did not remember him. He was gone, absorbed by the ruin he had created, a man undone not by enemies, but by the very hunger that had driven him. Daniel dragged himself through the snow, every step a war against his failing body. His chest burned, his ribs splintered, and his legs screamed with fatigue. But he would not fall. Not now. Lila was half collapsed against his shoulder, trembling, her face streaked with soot and tears. She clutched the bundle of documents against her chest, the last heartbeat of Ranger's sacrifice, the proof that their suffering had meant something. The dog's absence was a weight heavier than the storm. Ranger's bark no longer split the night. His body was gone, carried into fire so that the two of them could stand here breathing. Daniel felt the hollow space in his chest, where loyalty used to walk beside him, paw by paw. He wanted to collapse under it, to let the snow cover him, and never rise again. But Lila's hand gripped his sleeve, small and fragile, yet fierce, as if tethering him to life. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice ragged. "We can't stop." Her words pierced deeper than any command. Daniel forced one more step, then another, leaning into the gale. The mountain swallowed their footprints behind them, but they pushed forward, away from the inferno, into the white unknown. The storm raged as though Morning Ranger itself. Each gust carried a memory, the dog charging into battle, the snarl that sent men twice his size staggering, the final leap into flame. Daniel saw it replay again and again in the flicker of lightning across the snow, each vision a fresh wound. Yet there was also pride. Ranger had chosen his path. He had not been commanded or leashed. He had decided, and in that choice, he had saved them both. Hours blurred in the storm. Daniel no longer knew how far they'd gone, only that his legs moved without asking, carrying Lila through a world of endless white. His mind clung to rhythm, breathe, step, endure. But Lila's arms remained tight around the documents, as though they were more precious than warmth. She didn't let go, not even when exhaustion made her stumble. At last, through the curtain of snow shapes emerged, headlights, cutting the dark shouts carried by the wind. Uniformed men trudged toward them, lanterns swaying, rifles slung across their backs. Rescue had arrived. Daniel almost collapsed with relief. He waved an arm, his voice raw. "Here, over here." They reached him, strong hands catching Lila as she sagged into them, others bracing Daniel before he toppled. The storm muffled everything, but he caught fragments, survivors, the blast, medical tent. His body was lifted, carried toward the trucks parked at the edge of the pass. Inside, the warmth of the makeshift command post, the chaos of fire and snow gave way to the sterility of order. Radios crackled, officers barked updates, medics worked in silence. Daniel lay on a cot, his chest wrapped in bandages, his body finally surrendering. Across the tent, Lila sat huddled in a blanket, her eyes hollow but unbroken. An investigator crouched beside her, speaking softly. "You carried something out with you, didn't you, Papers?" She hesitated, fingers trembling as she pulled the bundle from beneath her coat. The leather folder was charred at the edges, but intact. She set it on the table. The officer opened it, and the air shifted. Inside were Victor's ledgers, contracts, and photographs. Names of officials he had bribed, receipts of weapons trafficked through the mine, lists of workers buried alive in unreported cave-ins, files of children exploited, lives broken, entire towns suffocated under his greed. Every page bled with truth too long buried. The officer's jaw tightened as he turned the evidence over. This brings him down. Not just him, everyone tied to him. Word spread quickly. Commanders leaned over the files, whispering in disbelief. Phones rang. Orders were shouted. What Victor had hidden in darkness for decades was now laid bare under harsh light. His empire was not merely destroyed by fire, it was dismantled by truth. Daniel watched from the cot, exhaustion pressing him down, but a grim satisfaction rooting him to the moment. This was justice. Not revenge carved with knives or vengeance shouted in fire. Justice was fragile papers in the hands of men who would no longer look away. Lila's gaze never left the table. Tears streamed silently as she saw the pages turned proof of every nightmare she had endured. But there was no shame in her face anymore. She wasn't just a survivor. She was the messenger, the one who carried truth through fire and storm. Ranger's sacrifice had not been in vain. Later, as dawn bled pale across the peaks, the storm began to break. The world softened, light filtering through torn clouds, touching the snow with fragile warmth. Trucks rolled down the mountain, carrying the wounded and the dead, but also carrying the truth out of its prison. Daniel sat beside Lila in the back of one of the transports. The rumble of the engine was steady, soothing. She leaned against him, finally closing her eyes, her small hand still clutching his sleeve. "Ranger would have liked this," she whispered without opening her eyes. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. "He didn't die for nothing." She shook her head, voice stronger. "No, he lived for something." The words lingered, fragile, yet unbreakable. Daniel turned his face to the window, watching the mountain recede. Somewhere within that frozen tomb lay Victor, his empire entombed beside him. Somewhere within the ashes, Ranger rested as well. But unlike Victor, Ranger's legacy was not buried. It walked with them, breathed with them, carried forward in every step Lila would take from this day on. By the time they reached the city, the truth had already spread. News anchors' voices filled radios. Victor's empire exposed systemic corruption, revealed justice on the horizon. Crowds gathered, candles flickering in vigil for those who had vanished under his hand. Anger boiled. but hope burned brighter. Daniel stood with Lila on the courthouse steps. Days later, reporters swarming below flashbulbs slicing the air. Officials filed into chambers carrying the files she had saved the evidence Ranger had bought with his life. The crowd chanted demanding justice. Lila didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. The girl who had been a victim was now a symbol, her silence louder than any speech. Daniel stood beside her, not as her savior, but as her witness. Inside the courtroom, verdicts would be written, chains of corruption snapped link by link. But outside in the winter air, Lila lifted her face to the sky. Snow drifted softly, no longer a storm, just a quiet benediction. She breathed it in tears freezing on her cheeks, and for the first time, she let herself smile. Justice had not come from the barrel of a gun or the weight of an explosion. It had come from truth, clawed out of the earth, carried through fire, protected by sacrifice. Victor was gone. Ranger was gone. But neither had vanished. One was erased, forgotten. The other lived forever in the memory of a girl who refused to bow, in the heart of a soldier who refused to quit, and in the roar of a storm that had not been able to silence them. The mountain slept again, scarred but free. And in its silence, a new story began. One not of power or greed, but of survival, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between truth and those who dared to carry it. Snow fell in slow, unhurried veils, soft as breath, covering the town in a silence that felt reverent. For once the wind did not howl in fury. It whispered instead, as though the whole mountain had bent its head to honor what was about to happen. The townspeople gathered on the crest, where the cemetery overlooked the valley, their boots sinking into white drifts, breath rising in ghostly clouds. No one spoke above a murmur. Even the children clutched their parents' coats and stared wide-eyed, understanding, without explanation, that this day was sacred. At the center stood a simple pine casket, smaller than any meant for a man, larger than any cradle. Draped over it was Ranger's collar, the leather worn, the brass tag dulled by battle. Beside it, Daniel held Lila's hand. His grip was steady, though his heart trembled. He had faced gunfire, firestorms, betrayal, and death. But standing before the grave of the dog who had saved them both was the hardest act of all. The pastor began with a few words, his voice carried by the snow. We gather not only to grieve, but to remember loyalty, greater than fear, courage deeper than instinct. Ranger was not just an animal. He was family, protector, warrior. And in his final breath, he gave us more than safety. He gave us hope. The townsfolk bowed to their heads. Some wept openly. Men who had once scoffed at sentiment wiped their eyes. Women pressed hands over their mouths. Ranger had not belonged to one man or one girl. He had belonged to all of them, defending the community against a darkness too long ignored. His sacrifice was theirs to honor. Daniel stepped forward, snow crunching under his boots. He placed a folded flag beside the collar, a token given by fellow veterans who recognized Ranger as one of their own, a soldier who had fallen in the line of duty. He swallowed voice rough when he spoke. He never asked for medals. He never needed recognition. He just did what he was born to do, stand between us and the fire. I owed him my life more times than I can count. But today, I know I owe him more than that. Because of Ranger, this little girl beside me is alive. Because of him, I have something to fight for, beyond survival. Lila, wrapped in a coat far too big for her, let go of his hand and stepped closer to the casket. The snowflakes clung to her lashes, melting with her tears. Her voice was a whisper at first, but carried in the hush. Thank you for saving me when no one else could. Thank you for being my friend. I'll never forget you. She set a small object on the casket, a worn ribbon she had kept hidden in her pocket, the last piece of her childhood before the nightmare began. She had guarded it as a secret talisman, and now she gave it freely, entrusting it to Ranger, as though tying her past to his eternal rest. The casket was lowered, the ropes creaking the earth, waiting with open arms beneath the snow. One by one, townsfolk stepped forward to drop roses, pine boughs, tokens of gratitude into the grave. The sound of soil hitting wood was muffled by the snow, as though the earth itself refused to wound what it embraced. When the service ended, no one hurried to leave. People lingered, touching Daniel's shoulder, pressing Lila's hand, offering food warmth, stories of their own encounters with Ranger. The girl's eyes widened, with each tale how Ranger had pulled a lost child from a frozen ditch, how he had chased thieves out of barns, how he had stood guard in blizzards until men returned safely. She realized that even before she knew him, Ranger had already been watching over her world. That night back at Daniel's cabin, the storm finally cleared. Stars burned like scattered embers across the black sky, and in the hearth a fire snapped gently. Lila sat curled in a blanket, her cheeks flushed from warmth, her body finally safe. Daniel watched her with a heaviness in his chest, a weight that was not grief, but responsibility. Papers lay on the table before him. Not the kind that exposed empires, but the kind that built families. Adoption forms, legal custody, promises inked in law. He had wrestled with the decision for days, wondering if he was worthy if a man broken by war and loss could offer stability to a girl shattered by betrayal. But Ranger's absence had answered him. He could not let her drift. She needed more than a roof, she needed belonging. When he told her, her eyes widened. "Adopt me," she whispered, as though afraid the words might vanish if she said them too loud. Daniel nodded, his voice steady. "I can't replace what you lost. I can't erase what you've been through. But I can promise this, you'll never face it alone again. Not while I'm breathing." The silence stretched, then broke with a sound Daniel had not heard from her, before a laugh fragile and uncertain, but real. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. For the first time since the night he had found her, she let herself believe she was home. Days turned into weeks. The town rebuilt not only its streets, but its soul. The trial against Victor's associates began, fueled by the documents Lila had carried through fire. Each headline carved another stone off the weight that had crushed them. Justice was slow, but it was moving. And Daniel's cabin life took a quieter rhythm. Mornings with porridge and hot cocoa. Afternoons where Lila read by the fire while Daniel mended tools. She painted the walls with drawings, flowers, mountains, even Ranger immortalized in bright strokes. The cabin no longer felt like a bunker. It felt like a home. But the true healing came not in grand gestures, but in small moments. Lila learning to laugh again when Daniel tripped over his own boots. Daniel finding himself humming old tunes while chopping wood. The silence of trauma gave way to the ordinary noise of life, and that noise was beautiful. Spring crept in slowly. Snow melted from rooftops, rivers cracked free of ice, and fields breathed green again. On a clear morning, Daniel and Lila walked hand in hand to the cemetery. Ranger's grave lay beneath a young oak, its branches already tipped with buds. Beside it was another stone, smaller, older, her mother's. Lila knelt between them, the hem of her dress brushing the thawing earth. In her hand was a candle, its flame trembling but alive. She set it gently in the snow and whispered, her voice carried by the still air, "I survived. Because of you, Mama. Because of you, Ranger. I'm still here." The flame danced fragile against the breeze, yet it did not go out. Her words lingered in the silence, sinking deep into the soil, rising toward the branches. Daniel stood behind her head, bowed, letting her own ritual unfold. It was not his place to speak. This was between her and the two spirits who had guided her here. When she rose, she turned to him, her face illuminated by the small light. "I'm ready," she said simply. He nodded. "Then we start." As they walked away, the camera of life itself seemed to lift. The graves faded behind them, but the candle's glow remained a small star against the snow. The lens of the world tilted upward, past the branches of the oak, past the thinning clouds to the sky, where dawn was breaking. The horizon blazed with gold and rose light spilling across the mountains like a promise. It was not the light of fire or destruction. It was the light of beginning, of healing, of a world remade not by greed, but by love carried forward. Lila squeezed Daniel's hand tighter as the first rays touched her face. She closed her eyes, breathed deep, and for the first time the weight of the past loosened its grip. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a daughter. She was home. And above them, the sky burned with a new day, bright, vast, unbroken, carrying Ranger's spirit in every beam of light, carrying her mother's love in every warmth of sun. The storm was gone. Hope had come, and with it, a beginning.